These last few days have been so unnecessarily cold, but it's finally warming up tomorrow, so I thought I could squeeze in one more cozy dinner with my super easy chili. This chili it's so easy. It's just a tiny bit of chopping, and if you've got a couple hours to let it simmer on the stove, it is totally worth the wait. This is beef and beans and tomato sauce. It is warm and cozy. Cheers. And it's so delicious in so many ways. I just like mine simple with saltines, but this is great with some shredded cheese on top. You can add sour cream, Fritos, whatever you want. So I used the other halves of these 3 bell peppers earlier in the week for stir fry. And this is basically how much I need for chili. So I'm going to go ahead and dice this all up for that. And I like a pretty small dice in my chili. If you like bigger pieces, then absolutely feel free to use bigger pieces. You also don't have to use all 3 colors. This is just what I had left over in my fridge. And none of it has to be perfect. I just like to make sure that they're all basically about the same size, really small. My peppers are all cut up. I'm going to give these a quick rinse and just set these aside. The only other thing we have to cut up for this recipe is the meat. You can absolutely use ground beef for this. If you are, just make sure you brown it before you put everything else in your pot. And I would use probably a pound of ground beef for this. This is 8 ounces of beef. I would normally use 10, but I had 8, so that's what I'm using today. And I like this meat to be cut up pretty small too. And I like to choose a piece of meat that's got a little bit of fat on it because this is going to slow cook on the stove for a couple of hours, so that fat will render out and just become really nice in the whole dish. If you have some onions that you wanted to dice up, or if you wanted to use fresh garlic, here I'll be using jarred garlic because that's what I use most often. But if you have some onions you want to dice up or some fresh garlic, those are definitely great additions to this dish. Chili is one of my easy meals though, so as little chopping as I can do. My meat is all cut up. I'm going to go wash my hands and then get started on the stove. I've got this 3-quart Dutch oven that I really like to use for things like this. It just holds the heat really well, and I can sear everything in it and then just let it slow cook on the stove top for as many hours as I need to. Since this is hot, I'm going to add in some olive oil. And then I'm just going to put in all of my meat to let that sear a little bit. And I like to kind of spread it out so that it doesn't steam too much. And I'm just going to let that sit for a few minutes. While that's sitting, I am going to drain and rinse 1 can of whatever beans you like. I'm using kidney beans. If I was doing a double batch, I'd probably use 1 can of kidney beans and 1 can of pinto beans. But just use whatever you like. I think the red beans and the pinto beans are probably the best for this. If you find your meat starting to steam a little bit, I just like to give it a good stir and then turn the heat up to get as much of that water evaporated as quickly as possible. Sometimes I'll add a little bit more oil if I think the pan gets really dry, but once all of the water is evaporated, you should be able to get a nice little crust on at least 1 or 2 sides of the meat. All right, it's been a few minutes. My meat is really nicely browned and I've got some crust starting on a few sides. I'm gonna just push the meat to the outer edges of the pan, and I'm gonna turn my heat back down and add in all of my bell peppers. I'm gonna let that sit for just a couple of minutes so it can start to cook down. I will give it a little bit of a stir, but I don't really want to mix it all into the meat just yet. I just want these to saute on their own for a few minutes. My peppers are cooked down a lot. I'm gonna go ahead and give this all a stir, and I'm gonna kind of use the liquid from the peppers to start to deglaze the pan a little bit. I've got a lot of little brown bits kind of starting to creep up the edges of my pan from the meat. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to push everything out to the edges. And I'm going to let the rest of the liquid that's in here evaporate. And then I'll add a little bit of tomato paste. Just about all of the water from my bell peppers has evaporated. I'm going to add in about a tablespoon of tomato paste, and I'm going to kind of just toast that in the oil for a few minutes. It really doesn't take long. Once you can really smell that tomato paste getting a little bit more toasted than when it's just fresh out of the tube, I go ahead and just mix everything back up. And then one more time, I'm going to push everything to the outsides of the pan because we've got one more thing to add into here. Garlic burns really easily, so I've turned my pan down to low. And I'm going to add just a touch more olive oil, and I am going to add about a tablespoon of this minced garlic. And then same thing, I'm just going to cook that in the middle of the pot without mixing it into everything else yet, just for a minute or two until I can really smell it coming out. Once your garlic starts to change color, you should be able to smell it. I'm going to just mix everything together one more time. And I'm going to add in my kidney beans. Everything's all mixed together. It is time to add in tomato sauce and all of our spices. This is the tomato sauce I use. I just get it from my grocery store here. I like that it's in a cardboard box instead of in a can. I'm actually going to add about half of it to this, and then I'm going to freeze the other half and use that for something else later. You can absolutely use the cans if you like. If you do, I recommend using one of the 15-ounce cans of tomato sauce, or I'm sorry, 2 of the 8-ounce cans of tomato sauce. Or what a lot of people like to do is they'll add one of the 15-ounce cans of like diced tomatoes and then one of the 8-ounce cans of tomato sauce. We just don't like tomato pieces in our chili, so I just use the sauce. All right. That's about half of that in there. Give that a good mix. And then we can add our spices. Since I didn't do any diced onion at the beginning, I'm going to do about half a teaspoon of granulated onion. I'm going to add about a teaspoon of salt. My kidney beans were no salt added. If you've got regular kidney beans, maybe start with half a teaspoon and you can always add more afterwards. I'm going to add about a teaspoon of dried oregano. And then just a little bit of crushed red chili. The more of this you add, of course, the spicier it'll be. I'm also going to add just a little bit of chili powder. This is not the chili powder that you get from the regular grocery store. This is an extra spicy Indian chili powder. So I'm only adding about 1/4 teaspoon here. If you're using chili powder you got from your regular grocery store, maybe you can add about a full teaspoon. And then I'm going to add about 1/2 teaspoon of ground cumin. And then I'm also going to add some lightly dried, I get these lightly dried herbs from my grocery store. I'm going to add maybe 1/4 teaspoon of basil. And just because I really like them, I'm going to add another 1/4 teaspoon of the Italian herbs. Give that one more mix. I'm also going to add a touch of water to this. A little bit of water will kind of release from everything as it cooks, but this is going to cook for a couple of hours on the stove, so more water is going to evaporate. Maybe about 1/2 cup of water, and then I'll just keep an eye on it while it's cooking and see how it goes. And then I'm also going to add 1 bay leaf. Now everything is all mixed together. I am going to let this come to a simmer. Cover it with a lid, let it come to a simmer, and I will be back to check on it in about 30 or 45 minutes. All right, so it's been sitting and simmering for about 45 minutes. If it's starting to stick at this point, you'll definitely want to add a little bit more water to thin it out a little bit. I am going to see how close my meat is. And the way I do that is I just like to pop a little piece onto the lid and see how tender it is with a fork. Mine is getting pretty close. It's starting to break up, but it's not quite as tender as I actually want it to be. So I'm going to add about another 1/2 cup of water, give it a good stir, and I'm going to let it simmer for probably about 30 more minutes before I come back and check on it. It has been about 30 more minutes and everything is coming together very nicely. Let me check the meat here. And all we're looking for is that this meat is tender, and this is super tender. The smaller your meat, the faster it will become tender. And if you've used ground beef, then it probably doesn't even need to cook for this long. This is ready. I'm going to go ahead and get everything all plated up. All right, my chili is ready. I will be using a little bit of a deeper bowl because I really like to scoop it up and put it on crackers. But he will be using this wide bowl because he likes to cover it in cheese and Fritos. I just try to avoid the bay leaf so it doesn't end up in somebody's plate. And that is dinner.